Okay, and I'm going to give an introduction to you to the program today, and then I'll turn it over to you, Larry.
Okay, great.
Okay, welcome to the February Calumet Revisited Forum. I am Michael Bowes of the Association for the Wolf Lake Initiative, and I'm co-host with Dr. Valerie Penninan of Calumet College of St. Joseph. And Calumet Revisited is funded in part by the Indiana Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Before we hear from tonight's speaker, are there any announcements? If not, I have several. Ollie's Calumet Nature Exchange meets via Zoom on Tuesday, February 21st at 7 p.m. It will feature Dan Spencer of the Forest Preserve District of Cook County and an Ollie board member. And remember that licensed teachers in Indiana and Illinois can earn an hour of professional development credit by participating in that session. The Wild Things Conference is February 25th. I'll be there trying to sell books, and attending a session featuring Phil Willink and others discussing the Anthropocene and the Wolf Lake Abide.
Where's the Wolf Lake? Yeah.
The presentation this evening is being recorded. The recording will be available within a week on Ollie's website. Would everyone but the speaker remain on mute? After the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. Tonight, we will hear from Dr. Larry McClellan, who will be talking about the Underground Railroad. There will be a question and answer session following his presentation. And so, Dr. McClellan, it's yours.
Okay, great. Well, I'm glad to be with you all in Northwest Indiana and environs. Being with Michael and this particular program is something I look forward to every year during Black History Month. And on several occasions, I've had the opportunity to bring you up to date on the research I've been doing, particularly with the focus on Northwest Indiana. And tonight, I'm going to focus on sharing some of that and the overall story of the Underground Railroad. But to begin with, really want to open with a story. And as Michael had indicated in the press releases, part of the focus is that I have a new book that is coming out this year, and a good deal of what I'm talking about today is reflected in that new book, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But I really wanted to set the stage by asking you to go with me to 1841. And in 1841, John and Eliza Little, a married couple, were enslaved on adjoining farms in western Tennessee. And they realized if they were ever going to have a life together, they had to escape from their enslavement. And so in the spring of 1841, they decided that they would escape. And one of the curious things about western Tennessee and western Kentucky is that passing through that is the Tennessee River. And the Tennessee River is one of the few rivers in America that flows north. And if you look on a map, the Tennessee comes out of the Appalachians, as does the Cumberland, and both of them, when they get into the western parts of the states, turn north. So John and Eliza Little were able to seek their freedom by escaping up north by going downriver. And I've always thought that was an interesting kind of mix. So they headed up north downriver on the Tennessee River. When they got too close to the Ohio River, they came to a large swampy area. And in that swampy area, John Little recalled years and years later that he put Eliza on a log, and he put that log that log was in the water, and he had a couple small satchels, and he put the satchels behind Eliza on that log, and he pushed that log through that swamp. And John Little remembered years later, with every step I took, I had in front of me everything that I loved. And if I misstepped, I would lose it all. But John didn't misstep, and he made it across through the swamp. They got to the Ohio River, borrowed a boat. They took the boat across, and they got on the Illinois shore, and they were on the shore of Illinois, just east of Cairo. And they ran into some other people who were also escaping from the South, and they debated what to do. And these other folks said to John and Eliza, you know what we ought to do? We ought to just turn ourselves in. Let's go back to Cairo, turn ourselves in. Maybe our masters will not be too hard on us. But John and Eliza said, no, they were committed. And so they walked 370 miles, the full length of Illinois, to get to Chicago. And there they received freedom. They received some assistance to book passage on a lake steamer to go around to Detroit and find freedom in Canada. But I always love to tell the story of John and Eliza because it really underscores the fact that what we're talking about are thousands of human beings, of people that had been enslaved who wanted to find their freedom. And so they took off, not always sure where they were going, but they took off. They seized their own freedom. And I think that's pretty remarkable. And so what I'd like to do in these 2 minutes is share with you some of those stories, some of the background, and a little bit about what happened in the Chicago region and in Northwest Indiana. So I'm going to do a screen share and pull up my slideshow. And let me just ask Michael, am I up?
Yeah. Yes. It's
Everyone
okay.
can say, okay, good. All right. This is what Eliza Little said many, many years later when she's interviewed in the many years later. She said, we decided we came on barefooted all the way to Chicago. My feet were blistered and sore, my ankles swollen, but I had to keep on. There was something behind me driving me on. And it's that sense of that tenacity that led me to name my book Onward to Chicago, to reinforce that thing about we had all kinds of folks who were striving to find their freedom, and they reached toward Chicago. The book will be out in August of this summer, called Onward to Chicago, Freedom Seekers and Underground Railroad in Northeastern Illinois. I've done an additional set of research on Northwest Indiana, and the beginnings of that is some of what I'd like to share with you today. So here we go, focusing on Northwest Indiana. So also just to bear in mind, remind you of that journey from Western Tennessee, going up, crossing the Ohio River, going barefoot, going by foot, 370 miles to Chicago. And then they traveled by lake steamer around Detroit and then went on to freedom in Canada. This map also shows the remarkable journey of a woman named Caroline Quarles, who I'll talk about in a few minutes. But just to kind of orient yourself, why do we have so much Underground Railroad experience here in the Chicago area and in Northwest Indiana? And it all has to do with the geography. Recognize that Chicago and Northwest Indiana sits at the southern edge of Lake Michigan, and that means that everything to the north and east of us flows into the Atlantic Ocean. Just a few miles west, everything west and south of Chicago flows into the Gulf of Mexico, which means that right here in Chicago and in Northwestern Indiana, we are sitting on a continental divide. And for thousands of years for Native Americans. And when the European and American explorers started to move, the rivers and the lakes were the highways, and folks were coming from the east going west using the Great Lakes. And they got to Northwest Indiana, they got to Chicago, and they then had access to the Mississippi River Valley. That water access was absolutely crucial for everyone. And Native people for thousands of years understood that. Since about 1750, our particular part of the world has been the home of the Council of Three Fires. The people, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, and the Ottawa were living in our, right in our part of the world. And they understood this dynamic of this being a place of transition between the great waterways of the east and north and the great waterways of the west and south. Part of what's happened with Native peoples was the development of a historic road crossing this great zone of transition. And that was, of course, the Sauk Trail, which runs right through Northwest Indiana. In addition, the Native peoples hundreds of years ago established what comes to be called the Vincennes Trace or Hubbard's Trail, which again brings people from the Ohio River and the Wabash coming straight north into the Chicago region. So we are in this point of transition, in this point of movement between the two great water systems. And that really sets the story, because European and Americans coming from the east came by water, eventually by Lake Michigan into the Chicago region, or they came overland from Detroit, Toledo, those areas. And again, because particularly the location of the Kankakee marshes, all of those folks were forced to transit through a 20-mile corridor, which is Northwest Indiana. It is no accident that La Porte is where it is. La Porte, in French, La Porte, the door. This was the great door to the west. For those Europeans and American explorers traveling, coming to see the engage with Native peoples, they were coming into the west right through our corridor, which is Northwest Indiana and the Chicago region. And again, why is it there? It's because of that great continental divide. However, as we look at these concerns about freedom seekers and the Underground Railroad, always want to take a minute and don't forget the conditions of slavery. What set all this up was an absolutely horrendous context of hundreds of thousands of people who were captured and kidnapped in Africa, put on slave ships, brought to the United States over the course of several hundred years to the Americas. 12 million were brought in bondage. Of that 12 million, about 400,000 came to what we know today as the United States. And the roughly, I believe the latest number is about 43 million African Americans. Almost all of people who understand themselves as African Americans in our country are descendants in one way or another of that 400,000 that were brought here in chains prior to the American Revolution. And of course, part of slavery was that horrendous reality of people selling other people, of people being treated as property. When I'm doing my research in the 30s and 40s, only a little bit of it is in census records. I'm looking at property records, and it's there where I find the estate sales and the tax records, where you find the information about the horses and the cattle and the sheep and the pigs and the slaves. Just a horrendous part of our history that, as we all know, we are still grappling with. So one of the things that happened was that people seizing their freedom in the South headed north. And as they headed north, people responded to their needs, and that creates the Underground Railroad. And of course, it was not a real railroad, and it was not underground. And this is an image from 1844, was showing a great classic image of a train going underground. the Great Liberty Line, but of course it was not underground, nor was a railroad. It was, I think, best defined as networks of response. Freedom seekers started coming into the free states. And as they came in, people responded. And those responses then became organized as the Underground Railroad. And where did people go? Freedom seekers went to the south, into the Caribbean, to Mexico. They went west to be with native peoples. The vast majority came north into the free states. And while we're looking at this map to understand the Underground Railroad story, one or two other elements. This is a map from 1850. Notice where the bottom of Illinois is, down here. And this whole southern part of Illinois and some of the southern reaches of Indiana are all further south than most of the state of Virginia. This part of our states in Indiana and Illinois were, if you will, profoundly southern. And I think it's important to realize that. And also to see here, you see so clearly the Mississippi coming up the middle of the country, and Illinois, Indiana are free states, but they are bounded by Missouri and Kentucky. Illinois had more boundary with slave states than any other state. It is part of the reason that we end up having a number of freedom seekers in Illinois and Indiana, is because they were close by. Okay, now, in terms of who comes through the area, probably 6,000 to 10,000 freedom seekers in one way or another came into Illinois. And of those, my research suggests that leaving Chicago either by lake steamer or coming overland or coming by lake steamers along the southern coast, somewhere around 3,000 to 4,500 freedom seekers headed toward Detroit and freedom in Canada. I think in round numbers, we could say that roughly 700 to 1,500 freedom seekers in one way or another came across northern Indiana. And in northeastern Illinois, I've identified in excess of 30 communities where we know freedom seekers visited at one time or another. If I did a companion map of Northwest Indiana, I'd have probably about 15 to 20 additional sites where there's pretty good evidence that freedom seekers were traveling through and receiving assistance. Now, how did folks come? As they came into northern Illinois and across northwest Indiana, there were really two streams of movement. One stream was coming out of the Illinois River Valley, going northeast into Chicago. And Michael, do you all see my cursor when I do things with my cursor?
Yes.
You do see that. Okay, good. So there was this movement coming into Chicago, and then from Chicago going by lake steamer along the coast or going overland. There was a second stream of movement that bypassed Chicago and went straight east across northwest Indiana. The first stream focuses on the great Detroit to Chicago road, and the second focuses on the Sauk Trail. And so when we think about activity in northwest Indiana and in the Chicago region, as people continue to head toward freedom in Canada, they are either following a corridor that has a relation to the Chicago to Detroit road, or they're following a corridor that is related to the Sauk Trail. And again, these corridors are there to avoid people having to deal with the great area of the Kankakee River marshes. And this is essentially a reversal of the use of those roads. The same historic trails that native peoples used, that European and American explorers and traders used going east, become the routes that freedom seekers use going from northern Illinois, going east toward Detroit and freedom in Canada. Okay, now that northern stream that I talked about that goes up to Chicago and then goes around through Northwest Indiana and goes across to Detroit and so on. People coming north into Chicago, a lot traveled in the corridor of the I&M Canal, the Green Line, and others traveled on historic roads that led from the Illinois River Valley coming towards Chicago. And so there was this kind of movement, if you will, northeast to get into Chicago. And from that movement, people then either went by lake around to Detroit and Freedom in Canada, or they went directly south to get around the bottom of the lake. Now, in Chicago itself, there was a remarkable amount of activity related to the Underground Railroad. In the 1830s, there was a unique group of Black families that were assisting freedom seekers. And these Black families were joined by a group of young white families. And the leaders of that white contingent of people that were assisting freedom seekers included Dr. Charles Dyer and his wife, Louisa, Allen Pinkerton and his wife, and Philo Carpenter and his wife, Ann. And all of them, as young families, were confronted with slavery. They were confronted by freedom seekers and realized they had to respond. And so in the late 1830s and the early 1840s, there were Black families in Chicago that were assisting freedom seekers. And there was this core of young white families led by these and several other people. By the mid 1840s, a remarkable group of young Black families had settled in Chicago. The leaders of these Black families were John and Mary Richardson Jones. And they, for years, were the head of the real heads of the Black community. And John and Mary and their friends were totally involved in assisting, and over time assisted literally hundreds and hundreds of people to get to their freedom in Canada. One of the key other couples involved were Emma and Isaac Atkinson and their family, the Reverend and Mrs. Abram T. Hall. And one of the remarkable things is that as the Underground Railroad in Chicago develops, there are, number one, many freedom seekers who come to Chicago on their own. Number two, there are freedom seekers that come and end up connecting with white abolitionists out in the other counties and come in and deal with those young white families. There are other freedom seekers that get to Chicago and deal with the Black abolitionist families. And there are also a number of places where these white and Black activists end up working together. And in many ways, the first great civil rights movement in Chicago was the movement of blacks and whites working together on the Underground Railroad. And that's a whole set of stories that needs to be told, because most understandings and most of the written material about Chicago tell it as basically a white abolitionist story. And it simply is not. The first people helping Black freedom seekers were Black residents in Chicago, then this group of young white families, then this group of young Black families. It was very much a racially diverse movement and activity.
Red Scott.
Hang on, something happened. I've got to
It's running
hang
away.
with me. I've got to. Okay, there we go. Okay, now, so in Chicago, there was this collection of white and Black families that were deeply involved in helping freedom seekers. There were two churches that were particularly important in the Black community and are still alive and well. Quinn Chapel, now located on the edge of Bronzeville at 24th and Wabash, and Olivet Baptist Church, which is the child of Zoar Baptist Church. And both Quinn Chapel and Zoar were real hotbeds of activity in the years before the Civil War, when people were coming through. They were the heart of the Underground Railroad institution. But of course, for all of the folks making it to Chicago, the issue was to make tracks for Canada. So they went via the lakes, via the lake, and they also went overland. And for those folks that went overland, and my hunch is, my estimate is that 500 to 800 people from the 1830s through 1861, 500 to 800 people traveled overland, and they went due south out of the little town of Chicago. Chicago at the time was about the size of the Loop, and they went due south. And as a matter of fact, we've got a couple of stories of people being a little hesitant about traveling south to get to Detroit. They had just come out of the South. And when people said, well, you've got to go south, they had some misgivings. But basically, they had to go 15 miles south to get around the bottom of Lake Michigan. And 500 to 800 people ended up traveling overland. And in our story of great significance was where they crossed the Little Calumet River. And this became a real focus point as all of these people were traveling through. And located to the northwest of this was the area that would become Roseland, initially an area of Dutch settlement. And to the southeast was an area that became South Holland, another area of Dutch settlement. And because of these Dutch settlers, it turns out that two of them, Cornelius and his wife Marte Kuiper, and Jan and his wife Antje Thun, both spoke English, and they have been deeply involved. They got deeply involved in assisting freedom seekers on their way. The Thun Farm has now been established as a national site, a nationally recognized site on the Underground Railroad, recognized by the National Park Service. A lot of my activity these days has to do with the Little Calumet River Underground Railroad project. You can find us on Facebook, and also the establishment of the Thun Farm Historic Site led to the development of what's called the African American Heritage Water Trail. And this is, we believe, the first African American focused water trail in the country. And there's also a bunch of information about that online. But just to kind of orient you, down here we are at the very southern edge of the city of Chicago. The Thun Farm was on the Little Calumet River. The Calumet home was up just near where the Pullman National Monument is located. Now, going out of northeastern Illinois, coming across northwest Indiana, was the Detroit to Chicago Road, established in 1825, 1826 by the federal government to really connect Chicago into the booming trading activity in Detroit. It became a major track for freight wagons, stagecoaches, and it reached through Dalton's Ferry and across the Little Calumet River. Now, as the Detroit-Chicago Road developed, and as freedom seekers used it traveling out of Chicago, one of the places they also encountered assistance was in Holman's Bridge with Ernst and Caroline Holman. That is today the city of Hammond. Also, interestingly, in Hammond's history is the story of Catherine Burns, also known as Kitty Gibson, an African-American woman living in Hammond in the 1840s, and we believe was helping on the Underground Railroad. Going east from Hammond, the Detroit-Chicago Road passes through what is now Gary and into the area of the Dunes. We know that in this part of Northwest Indiana, there was a significant amount of assistance being provided. Freedom seekers were hiding in the dunes. Occasionally, there was interaction with Lake Coast steamers. There is an interesting story around what's called the Devil's Punch Bowl, or the Alpha Wreck. There was a discovered lake steamer. They discovered the remnants of its burned activity, and it may be related to interesting stories having to do with the movement of freedom seekers. We have evidence of freedom seekers finding assistance in Chrisman, Chesterton, and Treymount. And also there's another whole cycle of stuff that we're uncovering about the activity having to do with the train lines that came through Northwest Indiana, particularly the Michigan Southern and the Michigan Central lines. In Michigan City, there were the Harper family, the Taylor family, and very interestingly, south, just a few miles southeast of Michigan City was the home of Daniel and Mary Lowe. And we've got some very, very good stories about the involvement of the Lowes in assisting freedom seekers. In addition, there's a couple really great stories about the train depots in Michigan City and the role that they played. There is at least one story that I think I'll be able to document pretty well. One story about a special train related to the Michigan, the Michigan Southern, that was equipped to help transport freedom seekers from Chicago onto Detroit. So it's an interesting cycle of train stories. So what we've got is that we look at the location of that historic Chicago to Detroit road coming across Northwest Indiana. And each one of those red arrows is a place where I think we're going to be able to develop really good documentary evidence on activity and assistance for freedom seekers. And that Detroit to Chicago road tied into the Great Sauk Trail, which went up to Detroit, and followed the path of the trail all the way across Michigan. Now, the second great corridor was the Sauk Trail itself, going across Illinois and Northwest Indiana, traveling through Joliet, New Lenox, and Crete, and then coming up through Dyer, Maryville, Valpo, Westville, and Detroit. And that corridor has, as the Chicago-Detroit Road corridor, has interesting material related to the movement of freedom seekers. First of all, this is, I believe, the only known photograph of the Sauk Trail. This was taken in central northern Illinois in 1920, and is testimony to the fact that the Sauk Trail coming across to Detroit was a historic road, hundreds of years old and worn down into the soil by hundreds of years of passage of native peoples and then European and American traders, and then eventually freedom seekers traveling that road. I really see the probably one of the most significant places related to the Sauk Trail corridor have to do with families that lived in Crete Township. The Sauk Trail goes across the extreme southern edge of Cook County, and Crete Township is at the northern edge of Will County. And so there were families within just a mile or two of the Sauk Trail that were deeply involved in assisting freedom seekers, and they all helped to establish this congregational church. And today, this church, it's in the background there, the church and the cemetery have also been listed by the National Park Service for their Network to Freedom program as a significant site for the movement of the Underground Railroad. And so what we have then is the northern corridor that followed the Chicago-Detroit Road, the southern corridor that followed the Sauk Trail, and then there was actually a post road that deviated from it a little bit. But along both of these linkages, we have found evidence of freedom seekers moving along. The city of Dyer, right on the Sauk Trail at the Indiana state line, has connections to several other communities, both north and south. There are some local traditions. I would love to do more research on the State Line Hotel, built in 1838. And it may well have, I think there's a good chance that there was involvement there. In addition, in Crown Point, south of Dyer, there was a real nest of abolitionists, and I believe there was some support for freedom seekers. Moving further east on the Sauk Trail into Maryville is the location of the home of Dr. Henry Palmer, who was the first physician active in Lake County and who also was directly involved with assisting freedom seekers. And one of the earliest historical markers, I've got it pictured here, is at the Palmer home. It mentions his activity at the Underground Railroad. It sits just off of Sauk Trail, about a half a block. That house is not his house. but that's where his house was. Going further east, from Maryville into the area of Valparaiso, there were abolitionist families who were willing to break the law to help freedom seekers. To the west, the Williams family, the Riggs to the southeast, north of Valpo, the family of Norman Tanner. All of those families present interesting stories that need to be elaborated and talked about. Westville, northeast of Valpo on the way to LaPorte. Westville has a remarkable heritage. It had a Quaker community and a Union church, both of whom had families that were deeply involved. And this ended up as the final home of Charles Osborne. Right? Charles Osborne, right? You got that? You all know who Charles Osborne is, right? One of the great forgotten people in American history is Charles Osborne. This fellow was considered by just about everybody to be the father of American abolitionism.
Wow.
He traveled all over the country. He traveled in Europe. He worked with Benjamin Lundy. He was an advocate for freedom for African Americans before anybody else was talking about that. And this guy ends up living with his family in northwestern Indiana, and nobody knows the story of Charles Osborne. A really, really great American hero, and somebody ought to grab a hold of that and really publicize the importance of Charles Osborne in the history of this country, the history of abolition, and the history of freedom.
We have a school after him.
In LaPorte, south of LaPorte in Bigelow's Mills, we've got some traditions of involvement. There were families in LaPorte, and interestingly, north of LaPorte was a small African-American community called the Bank Settlement. And my research suggests that the Banks were there starting in the early 1840s, right on the Sauk Trail, in this community of roughly 25 to 35 people in several related families. I'm sure would have been involved with assisting freedom seekers, but I don't have any direct available evidence. But the story of the Banks family is another one of those great Northwest Indiana stories that needs to be told. Okay, so what we have then, going across Northwest Indiana, is the Chicago to Detroit Road, which has a number of sites where there was clear activity, and the Sauk Trail Corridor, where there were a number of sites where there was very important activity. And I hope that someday my base research will serve as the basis for other people to really dig in so that we can uncover the real depth of these stories. Now, let me close by talking about more directly about one or two freedom seekers, because in fact, freedom seeker stories are always journey stories. I threw this map up here, and I think I've got 6 or so freedom seeker pathways. You know, people were traveling hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles out of Tennessee, Kentucky, out of Missouri to find their freedom. And given the strangeness of the law in the northern states, freedom was best found by getting to Canada. And so Chicago and Northwest Indiana were a great way station on the way to freedom in Canada. And part of reframing the story of the Underground Railroad is to really shift it to telling these stories. It's the movement of freedom seekers, which is so astonishing. And they were all over the country. There were white and black abolitionists and their families who were willing to respond. And that's the Underground Railroad. But at the heart of it are the stories. And I want to close by telling you the story of Carolyn Quarles. Some of you may know this. I've written a book about this. Carolyn was 16 years old, living in St. Louis, Missouri. She was the daughter of her master's son and a slave woman in the house. The story goes that her master's son, when he was about to get married, decided as part of his privileges, he would rape some of the slave women and a young woman named Maria uh, was raped, and the result was Caroline. Caroline grew up pale skin, long black hair, blue eyes, freckles, and she was enslaved in a household growing up with her free cousins. Finally, at age 16, Caroline, and I think she understood that if she were ever kidnapped, she would be taken to the fancy houses of New Orleans because she was a beautiful young woman. But at age 16, she decided to seize her freedom. And so she went down, she gathered together some money, went down to the docks, and convinced the ticket person to sell her a ticket. She traveled up the Mississippi River to Galena. She gets to Galena. There's one black guy living in Galena, and he sees her and says, "You're passing. You can't get away with this. You got to get out of town. We have word that slave catchers are already coming after you." So he helped her get on a stage. She goes to Milwaukee. She ends up, this is in 1843. She ends up the first African-American freedom seeker that comes to Wisconsin, and they are not sure what to do. And so she ends up being passed around among various families for about 3 weeks until finally they agree that she will be accompanied by a fellow named Lyman Goodenow, who would be her escort by Bucky to get to freedom in Canada. And so Caroline sets off with Lyman Goodenow to make it to Canada. And she comes down and stays overnight in Dundee, in Naperville, comes down through Will County, has some great encounters with people in Crete, travels along the Sauk Trail through Valpo, stays with a German family in Westville, and then goes on to freedom in Canada. And Caroline marries a guy named Alan Watkins, and Caroline and Alan have 6 children, and today their descendants all live in the Detroit region, both on the Canada side and the American side. And one of the great honors of my life was getting to know Caroline's descendants. And one of her 6th generation descendants helped me to write a book about her life. And just kind of a remarkable story. And that story that she came right through on the Sauk Trail. You know, every kid in Northwest Indiana, every kid in Northeast Illinois ought to know Caroline's story. And of course, God bless Harriet Tubman. I'm glad they know about Harriet Tubman, but they also need to know about some people like John and Eliza Little and like Carolyn Quarles. As I indicated, I've done a book about Caroline, and that's available online at eBay. But I want to stop there, and another time I'll tell you the story of Henry Stevenson, which is a great story. But let me stop there and go back. And Mike, I don't know if you can handle the chat, but if you know, it's a little complicated. But if you unmute yourself and ask a question, or maybe a question in chat, I'd love to respond. Are there anything in chat?
Yeah, there's, let me check the chat. Okay, Jane says, "This is so cool." But it wasn't a question, it was an observation.
Yeah, it was just me. I was just making a comment. I just thought it was really cool. It was really interesting, and I love seeing it on the map. I'm in my classroom still, and we have a cat that has been wandering around in the school for the last couple of months. And we finally caught him, and we're putting him in a home. He's getting adopted. But if you're hearing weird cat noises, it's a temporary cat, and he's into everything. So
Right. As a matter of fact, we saw him on your shoulder, more or less.
I'm trying to keep him quiet. So
There you go. And so, folks, if you have questions, either put them in chat or unmute yourself like Jane did.
Yeah, Terry Radke asked, what type of resources were you able to find?
Well, that's always a great question, because remember that the Underground Railroad was basically illegal activity. what had happened was that particularly in the 1850s, by the 1850s, probably the majority of people in Northern Illinois and Northern Indiana were anti-slavery. Not everybody by all means, but a vast number were anti-slavery. Of that vast number of anti-slavery people who would become the base of the Republican Party, a much smaller group saw themselves as abolitionists. That is, they understood that we needed to have political processes, we needed to enact laws to end slavery, and they were willing to be public and be involved in politics. Then among the abolitionists, a tiny, tiny number were willing to break the law and actually assist freedom seekers. So the number of people involved in the Underground Railroad was tiny. So, kind of bear that in mind. Lots of folks were anti-slavery. A much, much smaller group were abolitionists, and only a tiny number of the abolitionists were activists because of the illegal activity. Because of that, the resources for unearthing these stories are remarkably diverse. I've gotten a lot of material out of family histories. Interestingly, there are, particularly in the 1850s, there are a lot of newspaper columns. And in the late 19th century, there are a lot of county histories written, often having some segment talking about the Underground Railroad. And what you have to do, particularly with the newspaper articles and the county history materials or town history materials, you've got to go in and find out what they say about the Underground Railroad and then build on that. Because generally what they're talking about is very distorted. Most often it is seen, the Underground Railroad is seen not in terms of freedom seekers, but as the activity of kind of courageous white abolitionists. And that's only a tiny part of the story. But what's in county histories and town histories, what's in newspapers, gives us the points of departure. Then that takes me back into, I use an awful lot of census materials. And it is surprising in the 1850 and 1860 census, particularly, the number of African-American families that show up. And then that becomes another part of the puzzle. Are they residents? Are they people traveling through? What have you? So you've got family memory, you've got other kinds of histories, you've got the census materials, and you've got fascinating materials coming out of newspapers, all of which has to be worked together to make sure that you're telling an accurate story. Because almost every source has a real kind of point of view that they are pursuing.
Okay, I've got another question, but in the meantime, Larry, could you put your email address in chat?
Oh, yes, right.
And then if people have questions afterwards, or they can email you. The question is, Larry, that you indicated that you were pretty certain of railroad activity on a number of sites. What do you have to do to determine activity?
Is the question asking how does a site get designated? Is that, you think, the question?
Let me check. Okay, who asked that question? Oh, Jackson.
Well, let me get a stab at it, and then if they can add another bit of chat.
You were right in your assumption. It was more, was it based on local stories and opinions? And then what research do you have to do to say, okay, those stories are true, it was definitely a station?
Well, as I was, yeah, I mean, that's a good kind of follow on. It essentially becomes a matter of checking various sources over against each other. So that if I found, for example, a story in a county history, I then take that story, I say, okay, first of all, what does the census tell me about those people? And the census will tell me whether or not those people were in that community, but the census also tells me where they're from. And most often, those families may be from New England or New York, which were the origins of American abolitionist movement, when you're looking at a white thing. Okay, so find out who they are, where they were from, are they in the right place? Then there could very well be other kinds of records that you run into. It's essentially every location has its own unique combination of resources. And some of them will be very strong in terms of very specific details in a county history. Some other things may be very strong in a family reminiscence. And there are these materials kind of all over the place. I found one reference to a fascinating story in Michigan City that was in one of the old newsletters having to do with the lighthouses of Indiana. And it was, what a strange place. But in this thing about lighthouses, there was this, by the way, the story about these people that the lighthouse keepers knew. And then I took that story and I combined it with some other things. I said, aha, that reinforces my understanding of what was going on in Michigan City. So Jackson, does that kind of help you see that it becomes very much of a kind of iterative process of comparing and contrasting what you've got?
And it seems very complex.
It is. It's very, I'll tell you, it's for 20 years, it's been very complex research in Illinois. And I've spent a couple of years on Northwest Indiana. And hopefully, with whatever time I have left, I want to spend more time looking at Northwest Indiana. But it is extraordinarily complex. However, we've got to get to the story. Because if in fact, I'm very confident when I say that there were over the course of 30 years, 700 to 1,500 freedom seekers, people escaping their enslavement, came through our backyards. We've got to get those stories nailed down so we can really understand the power of that as part of all of our American history.
I have a question. Have you found out, first of all, I can't wait till your book comes out because I'm assuming all of this is going to be in your book.
Yes, on Northwest Indiana. I mean,
Yeah.
on Northeast Illinois.
Right.
The
right,
Northwest
right.
Indiana stuff will be, I hope over the next 2 years, to really put a lot of that together. I've gotten the base figured out, but I really want to strengthen that base. But hopefully within the next year or two, some stuff will come out on Northwest Indiana.
Okay. So my question to you is, do you find that some of the local historical societies, you mentioned a ton of towns through here, both in Illinois and Indiana. Are you finding that there is material about this or acknowledgement of it in those local historical societies?
Well, I've visited in Northwest Indiana. I think I've visited about 10 or 12 historical societies. And it is a very mixed bag. There are some places that are really conscious of and have done some kind of good basic work on explaining the Underground Railroad in their immediate locale. There are others that don't even know they've got information about it. And there were two places where people helped me with their Underground Railroad information, but then I asked a series of questions about specific families, which led me into another whole set of information. So it's a, like I said, I think it's very mixed. Some people, and that's the same all over Illinois, that, and it has to do with the size of groups and, whether or not they have any staff and so on. But I think that there is a significant amount of material yet to be found.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And there's some urgency too, because you want to capture the stories, some of the oral history. from
That's right.
people who are descendants.
Right, exactly. That has been helpful a couple times. And folks, I don't know how it is across Northwest Indiana, but in Illinois, huge numbers of historical societies are aging out. That is, they are being actively run by people in their 70s and 80s.
Yeah,
And there is a real question about what happens when those folks are done with their work. What happens to all those materials? Where does it go? And
right.
sadly, I know of in Northeast Illinois, I know of 2 instances where when the historical societies closed, essentially their stuff got thrown away. And that's just, for those of us who are interested in history, that's a real tragedy.
Right.
But we all have to be paying attention to your point. It is getting late. And there are materials still being carefully taken care of that people have not yet looked at.
And what institutions, what educational institutions around here, and I'm cutting kind of a large swath in Illinois and Indiana, are taking up the mantle in this regard?
Well. What an interesting question. That's my answer, I suppose.
Okay, all right. I was just going to say that's an answer.
Yeah.
That's an answer.
I'll tell you, there are, in Indiana, the state, I think you call it something different, but your Department of Natural Resources has done some wonderful basic work on historical work on the Underground Railroad in most of Indiana. It's a little light on Northwest Indiana. And it's just kind of it's kind of mixed. I've got a friend who's working on a high school curriculum, because I would love to see that available for people, but it is, nobody's really grabbing hold of it.
Okay. That's too bad.
Yep. Yeah.
Just speaking from a teacher perspective, like the teachers who are here, we're so overwhelmed right now, with the amount of work that we're doing.
That's right.
And
That's right.
I'm not like, I've been teaching since 1986, and I'm telling you, the amount of work that I'm expected to do now is substantially greater than it was when I first started teaching. And I was teaching at a very academic institution, and I love the school I'm at now, but it's just, things have changed. Who has free time, to give to stuff like that. So.
Right. As a matter of fact, Jane, part of what, in response to that, I've got a woman who is a middle school teacher, is working on a curriculum, because I think one of the things I'm hoping to be able to do is to be able to offer in Northeast Illinois, Northwest Indiana, like a week curriculum unit.
Yeah.
That then teachers could just take, and if they can use
Yeah,
part of it.
and it is standards and everything. Because I will tell you, like,
That's
my
right.
husband teaches social studies, and he teaches Black and Hispanic history, and he would love to have this. I mean, he would love to have it. He's trying to pull in stuff on Pullman and the Pullman Porters. He's trying to pull in stuff on, Jean-Baptiste Zablin. He's doing all this stuff, but he would love to have this history, because this is even more in our backyard, even more relevant. And I think, it's so powerful. It's such a powerful story. So, but as with everything, like, we don't have access necessarily to all that research unless we're doing, a program or a class at college level. So I think, that's like a great assignment for like someone doing their graduate project or something.
Yeah.
But
And,
I
as a
do
matter of fact,
thumbs up if you do it, because I think I think
yeah.
it'd be really wonderful. So.
Yeah, Michael and I have talked a bit about the fact that maybe at some place along the line, maybe with his help, I could talk with the Indiana Humanities Council people and see if they might be able to support some of the stuff, because some of the things I'm working on are Illinois oriented, and it wouldn't take a whole lot to reorient it so that it would be appropriate for Indiana schools. So hopefully we might get to that.
I have a
If you
question.
get to the Illinois humanities as well, I think, Larry, they might be interested in it
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
I would- But
Um,
you've written 3 books on this, Larry, and so individuals who want to get a closer look at it can get hold of the books. And
Right. The big book is coming out this summer from SIU Press. The Carol and Quarles book, you can get it through eBay. And we are out of print on my book on the railroad south of Chicago, but I am going to print a second. We're going to do a second printing of that, so that should be available in a couple of months. But I put my email address on there, and if you run across something you think I should know about, please let me know. If you'd like to be reminded when the book comes out about the book, just send me a note and say, let me know when the book comes out. Or if you have any further questions, I'll try to respond.
okay, any further questions?
I ask a question, please?
Sure, Valerie.
I was reflecting on what you said about all the popular attention, the popular assumptions, the popular emphasis on heroic white abolitionists running the Underground Railroad. And I know you could explain that just by saying that white voices have dominated the narrative in US history for a long time. Have you uncovered any evidence that descendants of white abolitionists sometimes exaggerate what their ancestors did?
Yeah, I mean, lots of evidence. In the particularly 1870s and 80s, it was a very, in the northern states, it was a very prestigious thing to connect yourself with the Underground Railroad. And so what happened was that a number of people who were legitimately abolitionists, that is, they were politically involved in opposing slavery, if they had any kind of contact with freedom seekers, that gets enlarged by their families as oh, well, they worked on the Underground Railroad. The biggest, no, there are 2 uncomfortable things that I have to do. One is gently deflate those stories that, yes, your ancestors were very involved as abolitionists, but there is no evidence that they ever broke the law. And that I have to gently deflate that story. And the second thing we have to deflate, of course, is all the mythology about the Underground Railroad quilts. And, a very big problem for those of us who are trying to do real history is that there is a lot of talk about quilts being used on the Underground Railroad, and that is simply not true. It is fake history. And if ever comes up, there's plenty of evidence online that, you don't need just my opinion, but that is a major, and I'm surprised almost always somebody will ask about the quilts. But to your point about the exaggeration of white abolitionism, yeah, that's and it also is very awkward because there is a kind of I don't know exactly how to say it. There's a kind of a racist cast to some of these great romantic stories of people, like I've got a handful of stories about white abolitionists thundering through the snow to rescue the poor black fugitives. And it's just real awkward. And we have to be very deliberate about reframing the story so that we understand that there were a lot of courageous folk who were helping white abolitionists and black abolitionists, but that the real power is in the story of the freedom seekers, and that we've got to avoid the kind of romanticizing of it. Sometimes another piece of that is sometimes people want to do some kind of an Underground Railroad experience. And I really warn you against that, because there was this profound human experience of people running for their lives, not knowing if they would survive, if their children would live. And I think we have to be careful never to minimalize that or in a way kind of caricature.
Thank you.
Any further questions?
Larry, do you have time for another question?
Say again?
I have a question for Larry.
Sure.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I remember seeing a Underground Railroad home or a building in Pennsylvania, and it was really notable because it had a secret passage or secret room. And I was wondering, did many houses have that? Because that's what I assumed, but maybe I was wrong. But what have you seen in your studies?
It is very clear to me, and until I see evidence otherwise, it is very clear to me that in northern Illinois and in northern Indiana, there were no secret rooms, there were no tunnels, there were no hideouts. That in the South and in places close to the South, like southern Illinois, southern Indiana, maybe there were secret places created, but all of the evidence shows that as freedom seekers traveled, when they stopped, they stayed in the barn, they stayed in a bedroom, they slept next to the fireplace. That there in northern Illinois and northern Indiana, the Underground Railroad was a kind of open secret. People knew it was there. People had to be careful and discreet, particularly if there were slave catchers around, but there were not those kind of extraordinary spaces created. That, and I've got, literally dozens and dozens and dozens of stories on the movement of freedom seekers, and they talk about staying in barns, bedrooms, living rooms, by fires. There is not a single reference to any kind of a secret place. However, other places may have done that, but not in our territory.
Thank you very much. It's really enlightening.
Okay, before we close, I want to just add something about our next March meeting. And that's on March 7th, and it will feature Stephen Bell and Joel Zavala of the Ford Calumet Environmental Center. And it's on caring for valued sites on Chicago's southeast side. So it's just not the marsh that they're the big marsh that they're worried about, but they have other sites that they'll be talking about. So I'm going to turn recording off,